Good day. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to this webinar. I'm very excited about all the people who are here today. We are mostly, I think, from Australia and some of the US. And thank you for giving up your Friday morning or your Thursday evening in the US. And I think the people in Africa, South Africa, and UK are fast asleep at the moment. So I hope they can all listen to the recording tomorrow, and I hope you all enjoy it when you join in. So I am Marga. I am the founder of CoordiKids, and I'm also an occupational therapist. I am passionate about children, and I've always been. I care very much for their well-being. I care very much for the struggles and the problems that children experience during their days and during the time that they spend in school and on playgrounds. I have 3 children of my own, 3 beautiful adult children, and I have 4 grandchildren, which I enjoy very, very much. So I've been working for a very long time, actually over 40 years, which is a long time. And through this time, I was always working with children, and the children and their families taught me a lot of lessons. And I think that's why I can say I have a lot of experience. So now you know who I am, so I'm going to go off air, and not off air, but you won't see me anymore, and I want to just do a poll and see who you are. So just answer these questions, and we can see who you are. Teachers, allied health professionals, parents. Very good. Okay, so it's a very good mixture, and I think if I look at it, a bit more parents than anybody else. So that is fantastic because I actually focus on parents in this webinar, but in the past, allied health professionals and teachers have also said they found it interesting, and I hope you will all enjoy it very much today. You can look out for the rest of the webinars in the series. Today is the big umbrella of what is sensory processing disorder, and then I unpack it over the next 2 months. So every week we'll have a webinar on one aspect of sensory processing disorder. It is such a complex disorder, and it's such a complex set of issues that people experience in their daily lives, and we really need to help them. And some of you might experience some of those problems yourself because you get adults and children with these problems, and it really affects big portions of life. Okay, so let me get this out and let me get of myself a picture of here. Okay, so let us continue. And we're going to talk about sensory processing disorder. That's why you are listening to me. This is a condition in which the brain actually has trouble processing information that the senses send to the brain. We're going to talk about the definition. We're going to talk about the theory behind sensory processing disorder, and which include modulation disorders and motor disorders, and I'll explain exactly what that is. I promise not to use professional jargon, so please bear with me if it slips up. And of course, which I didn't mention, is that you can definitely chat in the chat box. The chat won't be visible to others, but you can send questions there, and I will answer the questions at the end because it's too confusing to answer it during the webinar. Okay, so then we'll talk about all the issues that sensory processing disorder creates and all the things that we can use to identify this problem. And then a little bit about the neurodevelopment behind this, and then, of course, where to find help. So, as I said, it is a condition in which the brain has trouble with the processing of information. So the senses send information all the time to the brain. And that you can see on this image all the different senses, and there are quite a number of them, which I'll explain later. And the brain has to process all of that, and the brain has to decide which one of these are the most important and the most relevant at any given time, because our whole body is all geared on survival. So if your brain experiences anything that he or the brain think is impacting on your survival or on your safety, he will react immediately. So that is why if you burn your finger, you would not leave your finger on the match or whatever, the fire that is burning it. You will put it away without thinking. Your brain is geared to do that to keep you safe. So the brain has a big job to do there. So the process of sensory processing disorder means this process. So let's look at the process. So at the top, you see that all your senses perceive what happens in the environment directly around the body, and also what is happening inside the body. Then if you go to your right, these messages from your senses are sent to the brain via specific pathways, which we call sensory pathways. Then it's sent to the sensory cortex in your brain, where the brain processes that. And then the brain sends the messages back to your body, and that is your reaction to what is happening. So just to, a simple example might be, you might be sitting and looking at this webinar, and suddenly you feel a very cold breeze behind you. And your brain will tell you there's a cold breeze behind you, and you might just hop up and close the door or the window so that you're not cold anymore. That is your behavior. So somebody who's looking through the window will say, oh, your behavior is you jumped up in the middle of the webinar. You didn't listen to all of it. My observation will be, what triggered that behavior? It's the cold wind that person felt, and the reaction was to close the window. So it's just a different way of looking at and I'm going to say a child, but it's any person, and it's often, in my opinion, it's not always behavior, it's often reactions. So sensory processing disorder means the brain processes the information from the senses. So we have the 5 senses that we learn about in school. So the first one is vision, that little girl holding her eye. The second one is hearing or auditory messages. Then we have taste, we have smell, and we have the sense of touch. The sense of touch is, I just want to spend a little bit of time on that. That is really, really important, because that is actually your very first direct contact that your body has with the environment. So the old example, if people that know me will know that I use it a lot of times, is that if you sit and you watch this webinar and suddenly you feel something moving in your neck, you would probably freak out and either slap it or jump up or scream or whatever. But if you sit and you watch this webinar and you hear a fairly loud noise outside, you will probably turn your head towards the window and see if you can see something outside, but you might still be listening to my voice, or you might still be keeping an eye on the screen. So because that sensation happened a distance away from the body, the brain doesn't perceive it as endangering the body so much than when something touched you on your skin. And that we'll have a whole webinar on tactile defensiveness and on touch experiences. But that is why the brain perceives it as so important, because it's really close to the body and it can really impact on the body's safety and survival. So the other senses are that the man lying down on his back, the sense of proprioception. And that is, the sensors is in your muscles and in your joints. It sends messages to your brain about in which position your body is and where your body parts are in relation to gravity. The next one is movement, that little boy running there. So the movement sensations are actually, the sensors are in your inner ear. And there are 3 little semicircular canals. They are filled with fluid. And if you move in one direction, the fluid moves into the opposite direction and pull the hair cells in that direction. And that give the brain information about this person's head is moving in that specific direction. Now, when that boy is running there, you can see that the sense of movement and the sense of proprioception must be very, very closely linked, because the one tells the brain that the head is moving in one direction, and the other one tells the brain that in which way the arms and the legs are moving. So that boy can stay upright, he can move effectively his arms and his legs, and he can actually run through the water, which of course add another sense, which is the touch sense. But okay, I'm not talking about that anymore. This little boy with a pain on his tummy, that is just representing our sense of interoception. And that tells us what is happening inside our bodies. So can you feel your heartbeat? Is your heart beating faster or slower? What is your breathing like? Are you hungry? Do you need to go to the toilet? All of those sensations we call interoception, and it tells your brain what is happening inside your body. And that is really important for what we can call behavior or reactions. Yeah, okay. So let's look at this one. So you can see there are receptors in your muscles, in your joints, and in the skin. And those are the only 3 sensations on this image. They send all the messages through those sensory pathways to the brain, to the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. And why I shared this slide with you is you need to notice that the motor cortex and the sensory cortex are next to each other in the brain. So they are connected, and they are very closely connected. You cannot really, take them apart. Like that on the previous slide, the boy running through the water, I said, yes, it adds a sense of touch because he's running through water. If it's not running through water, what else will he feel? He will hear the wind in his ears. He will feel the wind on his skin. So they are always conversations and they connected to or so your movement. He has to follow. That boy looks very children, and definitely not myself. We don't look that good with balls. So anyway, so first of all, he needs the intention that he wants to kick the ball. Secondly, just hang on a second. I think we have a technical problem. Just hold on a second, please. Okay, sorry about this interruption. And somebody just mentioned that they can't hear properly, that the sound comes and goes. So if you have that problem, can you please just put a message in the chat box and we can see if we can fix it. I'll get the technical people onto that as soon as possible. Okay. Oh, yes, I see there's a lot of people. Okay, yes, well, apparently everything is okay. Now, let's cross fingers that it will stay like this. All right, back to the slide and the boy who wants to kick that ball. First of all, he needs the intention. If he doesn't want to kick the ball, he won't be able to do it. Then he needs good visual perception. So he needs to know exactly where the ball is, what the size of the ball is, probably the weight if he has used that ball before. And then he has to process all of that, and he has to plan. His brain has to do the planning, and the brain needs to send the messages to his body to react correctly so that he can act and kick that ball. Then that is rated. So you as a person decide, was it successful or was it a failure? So we all know that coaches do that for us. But in a young child, it's just like if you missed the ball, you know you failed. And if you kicked it, you know even a 1 or a 2-year-old boy or child will feel that failure or success. Then what you need to do after that, you need to adapt. So if it was successful, good, then your adaptation will be, yes, this is what I need to do. I need to remember this. This is how I do it. If it was a failure, what can I do to correct it? Then this process helps you to learn, and then you can start again with the whole process at the top. Now, in adults, we call it learning. If you are a coach and you coach kids, then you often use the learning experience as well. What we do in therapy is we use the developmental sequence, and we encourage to develop kids so that they can do it. So we see often children who doesn't have good eye-hand coordination, or doesn't have good coordination, or don't have even intention to participate. And then we need to make sure that the development takes place so that the child can actually do the action. So all of this works like a spiral. It's not a set thing like these images and the blocks, one follows the other one. It's in a spiral, the one flows into the other one. The spiral grows bigger, so the child develops more and more and more, and more activities will be possible for this child. The big thing is that sensory processing disorder affects all of these aspects of the planning and the acting and the deciding whether it was a success or a failure, and to adapt and to learn and to develop. And it affects everything of that. That's why sensory processing disorder is such a big thing. And I don't like, they are trying to get it as a diagnosis so that people can get funding for that. And I'm not too keen on that. For funding, yes, fine, that's good. But it's not an illness. It's more, it's more something that can develop or not develop. So what happens with sensory processing disorders? Look at the bottom part, the green first. You get your sensory modulation disorders, which I'll discuss. I'll discuss the sensory-based motor disorders, and I'll discuss the sensory discrimination. All of those are under the umbrella of sensory processing disorder. On the left, what support or intervention can these children or people get? First of all, occupational therapists tend to be specializing in sensory processing disorder. We have a number of physiotherapists and psychologists and even speech pathologists who are also very interested in this area and are also qualified to help you a lot. We can give strategies for you to get home, in the classroom, and then there are home programs like the CoordiKids program. So how does it affect a child and a person? But I'm going to talk about a child from now on. Socially, emotionally, physically, big effects. You saw that in the slide of the boy who wants to keep the ball. It affects just about everything that you do. It affects your education, and it affects your ability to learn. And then also other things like self-care, like teeth brushing, like wiping your bottom. We see many kids who can't do that. Okay. Next one is, this is the nosology that Miller and others have created for us. And I just love this. And she has done that in 2007 already, but I still use it, and I think it's still a very good one. So at the top, you have the umbrella sensory processing disorder. As mentioned, you have sensory modulation disorder under that. You have sensory-based motor disorders, and you have sensory discrimination disorders. So the red outline box we're going to discuss first. First of all, over-responsive. Oh, okay, so the sound is off again. I do not know why. What I'm going to do is I'm going to proceed, and hopefully it will be fine on the recording. If not, I will re-record and we'll send you the link. So hang in there because we have a lovely offer at the end. I hope it comes and goes, and I hope you will get the recording, and I trust that the sound will come back on again. Okay, so sensory modulation disorder, you have over-responsivity, you have under-responsivity, you have sensory seeking or craving behaviors. So I'm going to talk about this now first. Before I go to the next slide, I'm just going to change my headphones and see if that might help. Just hang on a second. It seems to me it helped, so let's continue. Okay, next slide. So this is sensory modulation disorder. It has to do with self-regulation. That's the big thing. These kids really struggle with self-regulation. They have meltdowns, they suffer from anxiety, they have concentration and attention problems. They are either movement seeking or movement avoiding. They are often overwhelmed, and after that, of course, a meltdown. Very sensitive to sensitive to lots of different things. They can have a very high or a very low pain threshold. So they can be the child that has bruises all over and can't tell you what happened, why he has these bruises. Or you can have a child who literally bumps into a coffee table and cries forever about it. Then most of these children also have sleeping or toileting or feeding issues, or all of them. They usually have social skill problems, and they are often over or under responsive. And I'll explain that a little bit later. The big thing to remember here is right at the bottom, I said these symptoms can fluctuate from day to day. So this is the big thing that is different from the modulation disorders and the motor disorders. These symptoms are day to day. For parents, it is really, really difficult because you never know what to expect. One day you can go to a restaurant and everything goes fine, and the next week you go to the same restaurant and your child has a meltdown. So that's really difficult, and it makes by the time we see the parents, they're often hands in the hair and they don't know what to do. They're losing their self-confidence as a parent. And yes, it's tricky. It's very difficult. So let me see what we can do to help. I want to explain a little bit more about the sensory thresholds. So we all have thresholds. The pain threshold is something that we all are familiar with. So some people have high thresholds for pain, so they can really have a fracture, for instance, and they don't experience a lot of pain. Another person has a low threshold for pain, and they find it very tricky to handle even a headache. So we are all different, and we all have different thresholds. The thing is that we all more or less function between the average thresholds for self-regulation and functioning. And by the time you get to the adult years, you have worked out a few things for yourself. So you would know that you are quite sensitive to noise. I'm, for instance, quite sensitive to noisy environments when I'm tired. I just cannot stand it. When I'm rested, it's fine. So you might experience something like that too. So people with high thresholds are usually the sensory seeking and the low registration, the limited awareness people. And then, so they might need more input than others. They might like all the activity of going to fireworks, for instance. They might love all the activity of a big party. And they sometimes just can't get enough. And they might be oblivious of a lot of things in the environment. They just don't notice it. The people with low thresholds, again, are very alert. They have very high levels of alertness. They are easily overwhelmed. They are oversensitive, and they are often quite anxious, and sometimes they can be quite defensive. So the high thresholds usually have poor attention. I'm thinking of a child in the classroom, for instance, and they tend to daydream. They can be movement seeking just to keep themselves awake almost. But I see a number of these children who just come in with no issues in the classroom, but they don't have any idea what's going on in the classroom. They don't disrupt the class, but they're daydreaming, they're not aware. But as I said, some of them can be movement seekers and they can move quite a bit. So the low threshold kids are usually those kids that function on the fright and flight responses. They are avoiding a lot of stuff. They are scared to participate in things. And we'll talk about in the next week, we'll talk about little Harry, who is afraid to participate in play parks. He's afraid of movement. So that is one of the issues that they can have. So what happens is that once again, you have your senses, like these are again your skin, your muscles and your joints, and they are sent to your brain and, as I said before, to your motor and your sensory cortexes, or your sensory cortex, which is quite strongly linked to your motor cortex. On the way there, it goes through a system called your reticular formation. And we call it also your reticular activating system. This is your system that controls your level of alertness. So if we can compare it to a filter. So the reticular activating system filters out all the information at any given time that you don't need. So it will, at the moment, if you are listening to me, it will filter out all the other things outside the room. It will filter out the images on your room. It will filter out other noises. It will filter out the feeling of the clothes on your skin. It will filter out the smell in the room so that you can focus on my voice and on the screen in front of you. So, and that is what the reticular activating system do. So if this system works very well, then it filters out too many impulses, and then you get the high threshold people, and they daydream and they're oblivious of many things in the environment. They don't notice that the teacher has cut her hair, for instance. They don't notice that their book has fallen off the table and things like that. That's now in extreme cases. Whereas the low threshold people, this reticular activating system doesn't work well enough. If too many impulses go through to the brain, they cannot focus on one thing. They are distracted by everything, all the images on the classroom walls. They're distracted by the shoes that the teacher is wearing. They're distracted by what the kid is doing next to them. They tend to fidget a lot, and they tend to have high levels of anxiety. So let us see. Now let's do another poll. I want to see, do you know any children or adults that have high or low thresholds? Is this something that you are familiar with? So do you know any sensory seekers or any sensory avoiders? Whoa. Okay. I think the poll is finished, and you said 100% you know people like that. So I suppose it's not only people, it's also children, and it's also adults, because we all know them. Okay, and you might recognize that in yourself. All right, so that was the sensory modulation disorder in a very, very tiny nutshell. Now we have the sensory-based motor disorders, under which falls dyspraxia and postural disorders. So let's have a look at that. The sensory-based motor disorders, these people have just difficulty to navigate through this world. They have real difficulty to control their bodies. And I have a little test, that a hand-finger test. And it's so interesting to see sometimes that these kids, and I've seen adults as well, who know exactly the movement that they have to do. They watch me, they need to copy me, they do it, and then their hands doesn't listen to what their brain is saying. And that surprise on their faces, but that's not what I wanted to do. And that is what we call a sensory-based motor disorder. So they are often, not always, nothing is always, it's often slow to reach the developmental milestones. I have many kids in therapy who actually were very fast to reach milestones. They may be late with sitting, crawling, or walking, or it might have been omitted, or between us, the parents might have reverted to walking rings and supported seating options, and those little muscles that need to control the body did not develop well. That is a topic for 3 webinars. Okay, so let's look. They often have gross and fine motor skills that's below average for their age. They may be clumsy. They may struggle to play games. And they may have difficulty to interact appropriately with children and adults. They are often the children who might seek adult company, or they might seek older children or younger children, but I find it very tricky to play with their peers. Now then, one of those aspects that I mentioned was dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is the Greek word praxis, means to do something, and the Latin prefix dis means unable. So people with dyspraxia are unable to do it. I just want to interrupt myself here. Don't Google dyspraxia, because what comes up is lots and lots of websites that tell you there's nothing that you can do about it, and it tells you that you will you will have to live with it if you have it. I have seen many children who have improved so much that they don't have strong traits of dyspraxia anymore. So rather not Google it, especially if you have a child that you expect has dyspraxia, because it will really dishearten you to look at all those websites. We have a webinar on dyspraxia at the end of November. Look out for that. All right, okay, I've interrupted myself. Next one is they usually have poor motor coordination, poor timing, poor planning, poor organizing. Oh my word, they lose their things. They never know where their hat is. They never know where the homework is. Is it at school? Is it in my bag? And they usually have poor sequencing, which can affect many different things. So this is a lovely resource that I found on Google Images. And whoever did this, I want to thank them because I think it's fantastic. So dyspraxia you have in the middle. And what effect does dyspraxia have? Look at the top: organizational skills, memory difficulty, sequencing, as I said, finds planning tricky. On the right, gross motor skills, hopping, balance, physical issues. Even getting dressed is a problem. Then just to the running is, I had a child in therapy. He was like about 5 years old, and his mom once came in and she said to me, you know what happened today at school? I was waiting for my kid, and all the kids, as they always do, came running over the lawn towards the cars and the mums. And today I couldn't identify my child. And what happened was that we worked a lot on the dyspraxia and the motor coordination. And he has improved so much that his running gait improved. And he wasn't running in an awkward gait anymore. So his mom couldn't recognize him because he looked the same as all the others. Isn't that great? So yes, just check out those websites. Don't believe all of that. All right. Then fine motor skills are also affected. So often they use too much pressure on their pencils, too little pressure, and they find it very difficult to manipulate a pen. Their handwriting might be really untidy, and they have concentration issues. They find it difficult to focus for long periods of time because often they cannot sit still, and they're easily distracted, and they need the activity to be broken down because they can't concentrate on a sequence of things. So break it down into 1 or 2 steps and give one at a time, then they will be able to finish their task. They have difficulty with communication, speech might be immature, difficult to construct proper sentences, difficult to remember, what did we do this morning? Was it before morning tea? Was it after morning tea? Or perhaps it was after lunch? Can't remember. That kind of thing they find difficult. And then just general classroom activities, just like listening, following instructions. And of course, you can see with all of that, social skills will be impacted quite a lot. And just to play an ordering game with peers where they make up rules as they go along, you know what kids do? They will find that tricky because they won't be able to remember those rules. Okay, and then you get the other sensory-based motor disorders. What do they look like? They are also clumsy. They can do clowning behavior. Clowning is almost, they try to be silly to hide that they can't do an activity. So if you see clowning in the classroom, if you see clowning at home, you can almost with certainty say, this is an activity that this child finds difficult. They often avoid motor tasks. They can, as I said, they can hold their pencil too tight or too light, that they don't have good control over it. They don't know where to start with an activity, like tidy your room or do an assignment, just don't know where to start and what to do next. The difficulty to follow a sequence, whether it's instructions or the steps in a task. They might break toys a lot because they don't know how to play with the toys and they don't see how they can play with it, especially in the preschool years. You often hear parents that just break toys or they try to play with it and it doesn't work the way they think it should and then they just throw it. Okay, then as I said before, difficulty to follow the rules of a game, especially if the rules change. So if you play the same game over and over and over, by the end they will know it and they will be able to play it, but to change the rules all the time doesn't work for them. Then they often prefer solitary play or older or younger peers, and they might or might not have issues with concentration. It often depends on the task. If the task is something that they are interested in because it is easy for them, then they can concentrate well, but they often don't know how to navigate themselves through the task and then they lose interest, which is understandable. Okay, so then you get the postural disorders. These kids have difficulty with muscle tone, with balance, with core muscle strength, and to operate muscles and their own bodies successfully. And up to there, all four of those can be related to babies who did not have, I don't say always, sometimes, to babies who did not spend enough time on the floor, who were in walking rings and in supported seating for long periods of time. These kids are often labeled as lazy or clumsy. They have a hard time to play with their peers, like physical abilities, like to play a game of soccer or just to play in the play park outside. They're often scared because they don't have a good balance. So if another child bumps into them, they will fall over. Whereas if they have good balance, they can stand their ground and they don't fall. So then they enjoy the game. But if you continuously fall over and if you get very tired because you have low muscle tone, then you don't enjoy these games. But with all of that said, they have difficulty to sit still because they don't have good core muscles and muscle tone, so they cannot sit upright for long periods of time. Okay, last little bit of this, sensory discrimination disorder. So it can be the discrimination. It means how you perceive the input from your senses. So it can be of only one sense or it can be of all 8 senses. So the 8 senses are on the left side under senses. The discrimination can be a poor ability to discriminate. As I said before, holding the pencil too tight or too light. If you think about it, you can actually, if you're sitting at your desk, you can actually close your eyes. You can find a pen somewhere, either in a drawer or on your desk. You can find a paper somewhere. You can write numbers 1 to 10 or your name on that piece of paper, with all done with your eyes closed, and you'll be able to read what you wrote more or less. You only made use of all your proprioception, touch, and probably mostly proprioception and touch sensors. A little bit of memory because you had to remember where you have put your pen last time. But so that means that we can do a lot without vision. And these kids really have problems with that. You will see that they often have their heads very low over their work because they have to see what they're doing. They can't just feel. And then they write very slowly too. What is the other one that I wanted to mention here? Yes, the interesting thing is if you look at the modulation disorders, which I discussed first, they fluctuate from day to day and sometimes from hour to hour, whereas the discrimination disorders and even the motor disorders are stable over time. So what they have problems with today, they will have problems tomorrow. It will be the same. And they may or may not crave specific sensory experiences. Okay, so let's look at the functional discrimination problems. If the child has sensory discrimination problems, they might have problems with touch. Then they will have poor fine motor skills. They will have problems to position the pen in their hand without looking at what they're doing. And they will have difficulty to manipulate things like coins or beads in their hands without using vision. And even if you have to rely on vision, you do the task very slowly. Then movement sensations, they usually have poor gross motor skills, and they can be clumsy. They might bump into furniture and into others. They might be these kids that they say they just fall over their own feet. They just fall over. And they might be resistant to active movements, and they might even be scared of movement. So listen to next week's webinar. We'll discuss that more. Okay. They will have difficulty with force, too much or too little force, breaking toys, also on the pencil, as I have mentioned a few times. Then the body position in space. They might have problems with posture and core muscle strength. And then they have also problems with balance, to maintain the upright position, and to support movement. If you cannot balance and if you cannot maintain the upright position, how on earth are you going to kick a ball without falling over? So that those tasks are just more difficult for them. They might not fall over, but it will be more difficult than for the next child with a good posture and good core muscle strength. Okay, I think it's time for our next poll just before we look into the neurodevelopment. So that will be the last one today. And I just want to know, do you have a better understanding of the difference between sensory modulation and sensory motor disorders? Perfect. Thank you so much. 100% say they have better understanding, and I'm very glad about that. Okay, so let's have a look at the neurodevelopment. This pyramid was designed by an occupational therapist and psychologist in, I think it was in the 50s or 60s of the previous century, and we are still adapting that and still using that. Her name was Jean Ayres, and she was just an amazing lady. So this is how a child develops. This is how we look at the child's development. So at the bottom, the little purple area is all your sensations, and there's a lot of them there. I've included gravity, and I've included touch, can be temperature, pain, movement of hair on the skin. There's lots of sensations. Okay, so on top of that develops first, and that starts, of course, long before the baby is born. The next bit, the biggest part of development, the orange, develops between up to 2 years. So, when a baby is in utero, they can move a little bit. When they're born, they can move a little bit, but it's very global movements. It's not specific, and it's not fine movements. by the age of 2, they can actually walk on tiptoe, they can jump, they can run a little bit, they can balance, they can do a lot of things, and a lot of development took place up to the age of 2. And on top of that, you get your development of the fine motor skills, and then also visual and motor perception. And if you think of that boy kicking the ball, that's quite important for many different functions, but also for identifying colors, identifying shapes, so that the child can be ready to learn to read and write when they enter school. And then also the forming of personal relationships come on top of that, your creativity, concept formation, memory. And then at the top, that yellow part is actually what you do in the classroom. So we can compare this to an iceberg. The big part under the water, you don't see that, but it supports the tip that's above the water. And in the same way, this big chunk of development takes place, and it supports that little bit that you see in the classroom and that you see in your functional life. And it often happens that there are cracks in this foundational skills and in the foundation of this pyramid. And if you think of the iceberg, if there are cracks in the foundation or in the part under the water, the iceberg will fall apart. And the same happens with a child. If there are cracks in the foundational skills, then they fall apart in the classroom. So CoordiKids has been developed to address those foundational skills, specifically the motor skills, specifically those very, very important skills that we name under dyspraxia, that we name under sensory motor skills, or under sensory motor disorder. And because I have seen through the many years that I've been working, that if we can help a child to develop those skills, and once that development is in place, it's just like magic when you see how all the other skills just fall into place. And suddenly the child comes back and the parents say, he has moved up 2 levels in swimming. And suddenly he comes in and he can say the alphabet. And suddenly he comes in and the teacher says his handwriting has improved so much, but he didn't touch a pencil in therapy. But the posture developed, the motor skills developed, his self-confidence developed, and then the tip of the iceberg is visible in the classroom, and that is also very good then. So we follow in therapy and in the CoordiKids program, we follow the normal developmental stages of a child. If a child misses out on these stages, they might have problems. I know people who are very clever, who went through school without any problem, who has uni degrees, who did not crawl. So you can't say if a child did not crawl, they will have problems. That's not true. But if they did not crawl, and they might have brain bridging or bilateral integration problems, and that means the 2 sides of the body doesn't communicate well with each other, the 2 hemispheres of the brain doesn't communicate too well, then they find things like counting, timetables, spelling really tricky. So it's very important that the child goes through all these stages, and if they have missed out on it, it will be very important for you to see that you, or to try and make sure that that development is in place, and if not, do some very specific exercises to do it correctly. So in the past, and it's still exactly like that, the brain has a lot of different areas, and each area has a very specific functions, and that is how I studied many, many years ago, and it's exactly the same now. We have the brain stem, we have the cerebellum, we have the cerebrum, we have all those different lobes in your brain, and they all have very specific functions. Then I think it was the psychologists who actually gave us this, the 2 hemispheres, and you have the left hemisphere who focuses more on the logic, rules, analytics, and the right hemisphere, which is more your creative part. And those 2 hemispheres need to work together to solve a good problem. So I know that they have said always that a person like Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, was definitely a very creative person, and he must have been must have had a very strong right hemisphere. But then they saw all the planning that he did before he did any sculpture or painting, and then that was all the left hemisphere. So to create that fantastic art piece, he used both hemispheres. And what we've learned since, now that we have lovely neuroscientist who does fantastic research, we have seen that no single part of the brain is separate from any other single part. They are all intertwined, they all communicate with each other much more than we ever knew before. And even the cerebellum, which we thought is only there to fine-tune our movements, are now connected to our emotional life very, very strongly. And that is why CoordiKids can also improve emotional regulation. But that's a different topic. Okay, so let's have a look at the next slide. This is we only have 5 minutes left. How can we help these children? Children with sensory modulation disorder, you need to meet their seeking or their avoidance needs. Otherwise, you will create meltdowns. But slowly you can desensitize the child, and you can help them to desensitize and to cope better in different environments and with different food. It's not easy. You need therapy to help. You can do some environmental modification. So you can help by providing specific strategies in the classroom and at home to help this child. You can use programs like the ILS, Fast Forward, CoordiKids. There are many that are helpful to address specific sensory modulation problems. Touch problems, many different touch experiences help. To desensitize, the Wilbarger protocol is fantastic. Your OT can teach you that. Then if the child has problems with movement, CoordiKids is great. Occupational therapy with a focus on sensory integration therapy, and then physiotherapy can all help. Sensory-based motor disorders, you have to have a sensory integration occupational therapist. You have to use CoordiKids at home because it will develop those skills that did not fully develop. Then the sensory discrimination disorder, what can you do to help? A combination of the above strategies, and if you can't do it alone, let an OT help you. You can even contact us. There's an auditory program, Fast Forward, which is quite good with the auditory discrimination problems. And then also CoordiKids will help you with that. Okay, more help at home. Very, very important. Observe your child. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't say this is definitely a behavior problem. It's most often not. It's most often a reaction. Then help your child. Be behind your child. Be supportive to your child. Don't stand across from your child and say, your behavior is unacceptable. Say, I can see you find this tricky. Let me help you. That should be your attitude. You can work out a sensory diet. You can help with visuals like this one that's up here, just to have the program for the morning. And this will help with routines as well. In 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, we have the sensory diet webinar, which you can listen to. Other interventions that can help is home and classroom modifications. I love these kids that can sit on boards. That's fantastic. I love the teacher. She's innovative. She supports children, but it won't work for all children. Some of them don't need it in the first place. Some of them need a stable seated option with a weighted object on top of their thighs. Another one needs to stand and work. So we need to address the problems individually. Nothing will work always for all. Individual therapy is quite important. You can subscribe your child to CoordiKids groups or individual sessions. The groups are never big. It's always 4 to 5 kids. So lots of time to have individual attention as well, and to modify the program to fit your child. Then we'll have a CoordiKids member Facebook page up very soon, within the next 2 weeks. And I'm very excited about that, because that will be a place where members of CoordiKids can post their questions, can ask, and can support each other and find support from us. Then you have sensory processing disorder parent support groups on Facebook. There are heaps of them. You can look there. It's often a place where parents vent, and not so much a place where they find support, but just, do you also have this problem? And that might help very much. And then there are sensory processing disorder websites which you can visit. There are lots of red flags and things that you can look at. Okay, now it's time for questions. But before I do the questions, I just want to show you something else. I'm